Hello and welcome to a video series where we look inside the Figma product teams. Today we have designers, engineers and advocates to talk about users. And Hugo, we're going to start with you. What regional nuance do you see within the Figma user base?
Well, Figma obviously being HQ'd in San Francisco, coming from a startup world, represents a fairly different picture to, I think, what we experience, at least on the advocate side in EMEA. Companies historically have a sort of, I guess, a longer lineage, or have been around for in some cases for several hundred years, and it's often the role of agencies in region to be a part of some form of digital transformation, for lack of a better phrase. I think you see that happening often by designers or engineers that have had experience in a startup environment or have worked in the United States and then come over and then often will pass on best practice and do some quite technically advanced work. But this also then has a degree of variance based just at a country level. So I'm using EMEA as a catch-all here, but actually it's even more nuanced whether you're looking in the Middle East, whether you're looking in Africa, whether you're looking in Europe. There's a huge degree of variety. Principally, my personal focus is working with a lot of Spanish and Portuguese communities, and there are some teams who've really heavily invested recently, and it's really impressive to see things like open source design systems being made available for very large scale organizations, which 2-3 years ago you just wouldn't have thought to have seen. So there are legacy businesses that are starting to see that level of transformation and reflect some of the practices that we've seen in businesses in the US.
Yeah. How do we communicate that there is a difference and advise on perhaps a different way of thinking about product development?
A lot of that is about buy-in for design at senior leadership level. I think that comes a bit more naturally from what I've seen with companies in the US. There is still maybe a lack of some of that seniority that we're seeing for roles in organizations based in Europe. And I do think we're getting there. I think that there is a tendency for some of those teams to maybe lean in a little bit too much into trying to replicate what's happened in the US, rather than, to your point, try and find something that works within the organization that they're in. That's a common mistake that we find teams often making. And I think there's possibly just a lot more convincing in conversations that need to take place first. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess.
And as a product team, that variety is something that we always need to keep in mind. Something we do a lot at Figma is dog food our own features and products. And I think this is an important part of what we do, because we want to make sure that the features we're building are first and foremost useful for us. But we also need to remember that we're not representing all of our users, and we never want to over-index on internal feedback that we get, or something that might work specifically for us but not for everyone.
There's an aspect on that just around maturity, that I know maturity as a word can often get overused, but just at least I know we've had discussions about this before, but meeting teams where they are at currently and finding features that support the current way that they're working, versus trying to push them in a direction that we think is of value to them to create a more collaborative connection, particularly between design and engineering, where historically we know there's always been challenges. And it's very difficult to sometimes work out that right balance, because for the most part, the reason why that hasn't changed is not necessarily just to do with the tooling. It's often to do with a political conversation that hasn't taken place in that organization. So yeah, there's that aspect to look at as well.
On the engineering side, practically what does dogfooding look like of our own product?
So within Figma, we've got quite a neat system. We call them commit previews. So whenever you're pushing commits on changes, you can just share a link with other Figmates, and they can really quickly test something out. And the great thing about that is you don't have to merge your code into master. So you can write absolutely whatever you want. No one's ever going to see that code. You don't have to worry about checking it into the repo. You can still get people to use it, test it, and that gives you just so much valuable feedback without having to go through all the code review and steps. So that's the first step of dogfooding, for sure.
Would that be a rough and ready, here's something I'm working on, or a more formalized end product?
Definitely, like, here's something I'm working on. Like, a commit preview will put you in a state where, like, they're going to see it temporarily, but they're not going to, like, keep seeing it. So if you want something where people, like, always have it ready to use, then the next best step is a feature flag. And the feature flags, like, we use them same whether it's internally in Figma or, like, for users, whether that's like a beta program, just trying it out on a few customers that are interested, or just releasing a feature for good. We'll use, like, our feature flag system for all of that.
And what proximity do designers have to these engineering practices of feature flags and betas and commit previews?
We're super close because I feel like we work very much together on prototypes and, like, what's in the product. So, I mean, commit previews basically use almost daily. Feature flags, we have like hundreds of them turned on. Sometimes you forget what's production, what's a feature flag, to be honest. But it's really like looking at the product and just like iterating right there with the engineering that makes it like really good. So I think it really helps the process.
And do these feature flags get bubbled out to the wider community of users as well, or is it just an internal thing?
We work with customers. So like we have a group of selected customers for like a feature, for example, that will turn on a feature flag, and like we'll iterate with them on a feature just to get like more feedback that's like external, because we're very biased on how we work. That doesn't necessarily represent how everybody works, as mentioned before. So I think it's good to like validate that.
You have to be careful with the feature flags, because if you have like too many, you just got like all these like states in your code, and there's like no way you know like every combination of feature flag on and off. Like you really want to like keep your feature flags to a minimum. And also we have a practice where if something's being tested, we only switch on the feature flag for half the people internally, so that like you might be like creating a new feature and you want to like test it on everyone internally, but actually it's better you only put it on half, because there's people in production who don't have that flag on, and you don't want to create a bug for them which you don't see internally because you've switched on the feature flag, but the bug was only when the feature flag was off. So you do have to be a bit vigilant and careful with the flags.
As a team, we're also constantly debating how we should validate each feature. So I feel like we have a really wide tool belt of dog fooding internally and working with beta customers. We can roll out an experiment to users in production. We can set up user testing and meet users and chat with them. There are like so many things we can do that it's always a discussion we're having, like what's the right way to validate this particular feature or this particular problem that we're focusing on right now.
Is that systematized? As in, like, we have a pattern for this kind of feature, or is it generally flexible based on the problem you're trying to solve?
It's very flexible. I think we do have some guidelines. It depends on like the phase of the project. It depends on, for example, we wouldn't want to ship an experiment for something that would be too disruptive for our users. Like we wouldn't want to completely change how the editor works for all designers, because if we're not confident enough that this is actually something we'll roll out eventually. But so maybe something like that will be better to bring up in a user testing session for like some initial reactions. Same for launching it on staging for everyone at Figma. It really depends. But I think there's still a lot of degrees of freedom in that decision. And usually what we do is like a mix of some of these methods. We also work really closely with data scientists and user researchers that are practically embedded in our teams. So while we try to learn from them, and like we have a lot of designers running user testing sessions or engineers writing dashboards to look at metrics, we do look at them for their expertise and guidance and how should we be thinking about these things.
Yeah, I felt they're like the data scientists are like embedded always within the like project. So like it's really helpful at the beginning of the project. It's like, okay, we know we want to solve this problem. How big of a problem is that? And then we talk about the definition of success from the beginning, which helps sort of frame the whole like solution after.
How does that balance between qualitative information we get from users in our forum and on social media and in anecdotal conversations?
I feel like it all has to be combined. Because for example, we can try to say like, oh, like the success of a feature is like increased clicks in something. But like just because somebody's clicking more doesn't mean they actually know why they're clicking. They might be looking for something, right? So I think it's a balance of like looking at both things.
And on the ideation side, you've got thoughts on confidence of your direction as well.
Yeah, I mean, so much of this is dependent on the variety of user base, and like I know that within dev mode in particular, dwell time is not something you would want to measure, because that's to your point, it's not an indication that necessarily it's people understand what it is that they're using, and sometimes it's actually a good metric to see that they're spending less time in a tool. I think a lot of challenges that customers that we interact with face is based on the size of the user base, and therefore, I've had experience in the past where when there is a validity or a need to run something like an A/B test, particularly in things like e-commerce, the chance to be able to run effective ones where you can reach confidence based on the number of users that you have is like 20 in a year. Because you simply can't run those concurrently with other ones, and it just becomes like a real challenge to be able to learn in that way. So I think you're more heavily reliant on the feedback that you get with a smaller group of people in a kind of more of a traditional user research capacity. And I still think that can elicit some really interesting results. There's also challenges with that too, but I'm sure we'll get into all of that.
You mentioned earlier about the sort of feature flag soup that you might be able to get yourself into in a problematic way. Yeah. How do we ensure that quality is still met with all these individual tests and ideas that are sort of bubbling around together?
So I mean, when you've got a feature flag, that means it's been through code review. So like on the code quality side, you've definitely got someone else to like check over it. From a product quality side, it's kind of, I think the feature flag is there to really validate that quality. So you don't have to like really worry about, is the thing behind the feature flag of high enough quality for people to see, because no one's looking at it until you switch that flag on for them. So you can actually start with something really basic, not ready for people to see, but so long as it's hidden behind that flag, you can then iterate on it within the flag, and then enable it as soon as you're comfortable or when you're ready to test it.
We first validate the solution, and then at a later point in time, we would validate the quality or test the quality. And for that, something we do a lot on our team is bug bashes. So we would all gather as a team, open a good FigGem file, and just start really do everything we can with this feature to stress test it and figure out all the edge cases that we might have missed originally, and really make sure that we address all these before we're ready to ship.
On the design side, when we're talking about quality and measuring the rigidity of an individual feature you're working, how do you stay across the patterns of the entire product to make sure that you're consistent but kind of able to deviate in a way that makes sense for that problem to be solved?
I think that's the nice part of having crits with like other parts of the company. Because like you're very embedded within dev mode, so you know the pattern of dev mode. The editor has so many different parts that sometimes it's hard to keep track. But then you go to crit, and everybody's looking from their perspective. So like they're like, oh, I might be working on something similar. This is where like we might overlap, and then you work with that person to figure out a pattern that works across the board. That's one way. We also have a channel, like Slack channel for like UI3 stuff, that you post a question. It's like, am I using the right component or not? And then people are riffing in there. So
a design systems validation kind of sense check.
Well, it's more like a collaboration than a validation. I feel like it's more like, okay, let's partner together to figure out this problem rather than like, okay, this is okay to use rather than like not. But yeah, it's like very much a partnership.
And the testing on the user side, would that still be heavily done internally before it goes out to something like a beta program, or is that also an opportunity to test that what you think you're building is even the right thing?
I think it's a combination of both, because I think at Figma we work in a specific way, right? So it's good to get feedback internally, because you'll get a lot of feedback around paper cuts and things like that, because people are very much into the weeds. But then again, like how we work with engineering might not be representative of like how all the companies work with engineering. So I think making them at the same time will be helpful. But like you have to, of course, do like this disclaimer that like it's a rough state, like let's work on it from the beginning together rather than like we have this more polished thing.
So when we're building tools for developers as a developer in a situation where most developers maybe aren't working in the same way, how do you zoom out and enable yourself to empathize with the end user?
Yeah, I mean, like being a developer, as you said, building tools for developers, like that's like an advantage. You're not always going to have that. So you kind of, I'll sometimes step back and just think, what would be useful for me? I think like that's always the first and easiest way to go. And then, yeah, you also need to consider all the other cases that developers may not be in the same situation. Yeah.
So how do we ensure that we're sort of scratching your itch and able to maybe set that as a standard versus accepting that the industry way of working maybe isn't how we'd like it to be moving?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look at all the feedback coming in as well, because you might think something works this way and you like it that way, and then you just see a lot of feedback coming in, you're like, oh, I didn't think about it in this way. And like, oh, they have like a different process to me. Maybe it can be like related to like, you know, you have a fixed version of a design, and then any like, you want your developer to always look at that fixed version and you don't want any kind of changes going to it. Whereas I feel like we work in a more kind of free form, like if you make changes, that's fine. Like we're always on the most up-to-date file. So like, yeah, when you're thinking about a feature, and even like as an engineer thinking about all the edge cases of a feature, it might be like, this works for me, but I need to consider all those edge cases of all those other teams that do it in a different way. So just have to kind of bundle that up, yeah.
I think also we do something called like product listening sessions every week that we listen how people are working, and like that's like the whole team joining. So I think we create more like empathy, and we discover like the different companies, like how they work in their processes, which helps like creates the like sort of get out of the Figma mindset a bit.
When we first launched Dev Mode, we had to figure out how we were going to get feedback from developers, because designers love giving Figma feedback, but with developers it was a slower start. And we did a few things. One is that we have a feedback form in our product that developers can share feedback about Dev Mode with us. And this actually is hooked up to a Slack channel that we're all in. So every piece of feedback that's being sent there, we all read, and we often discuss and share in different feature channels and see what we can take from it. And we're also, I guess, constantly thinking about how can we get better feedback from developers, thinking about what groups of users we can get together to share some early thinking with and validate our ideas. Because, it is always so helpful in making sure that you're thinking of it from different perspectives and not just your own.
I know that sometimes I can open social media and see some feedback on something and very quickly over-index on the importance of a single comment. So when you're talking about a feedback form that people are submitting, we're seeing all this coming in, how do you ensure that that's not the only thing that is important to put the lens on?
Yeah, definitely. So I think we're just trying to balance it out with, again, like those user listening sessions, dedicated user research that would usually be around the specific feature that we're trying to validate. We're also hearing from our sales team. Like, I think that is actually one thing that I really love about our London office, which is relatively small. So we sit right next to the sales team, and we have all these conversations that they share feedback that they're hearing from customers with us. So I feel like we're always trying to make sure that we have the widest picture possible, and we're getting feedback from all those different sources and not just social media.
Something on the advocacy side as well is being involved in the Voice of the Customer program. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that's done, again, slightly in partnership with sales and with the user research team, helping to capture combinations of things that we see online, but also based on those conversations and maybe being able to drill down a little bit more into understanding that problem at a slightly deeper level. On this point around where you index on the feedback that you're getting, I think that there's kind of, it works at both ends of the spectrum, because you by addressing the feedback of the people who are immediately giving it to you in whatever format it is, if they are consistently giving you feedback, they are a champion in waiting. They are somebody who wants to champion and amplify your product, and it's always better for those champions to exist external to the organization. They're going to do like an incredible job of that work. But on the other hand, there is still a missing group of people for whom they've decided that the product isn't for them yet or at all, and they aren't necessarily sharing that feedback. So I think that's the biggest challenge that we often have, is trying to engage, particularly I think in the context, for example, in the voice of the customer feedback form, in the context of something like a sales call, where there's an imperative for those people to attend that. They may be skeptical at that point and really trying to pick on the people basically on that call who are saying nothing, because those are the people who we need to get the feedback in to be like, well, what's that challenge, whilst also helping to address the concerns of the people who said, like, I'm using it daily and this is a point of frustration for me on a regular basis. And that's how you're then going to grow your user base, I guess, over time.
When it comes to signals from users and forms and sales, and we've got all these things going on at the same time, how do you still ensure there is space for gut feeling and just feeling, I know this is the right thing that we need to be building?
Well, I think there's the feedback from users that you're trying to understand why they're feeling like this, and then you have your immediate reaction of like on the solution. Yeah. And I think those two are like sort of in pair, because with that like immediate gut solution, you feel a lot of the paper cuts, because you can test it out and you're like, oh, this is so annoying to have to switch like 3 times. But you need to make sure like it's solving also the bigger problem. So actually, I don't think they're an opposite. They're like... On
the immediate, I have a solution framing, how do you slow down to ensure that you then take these signals to ensure that it's not just, here's the idea, and we go and ship that thing?
Well, I feel like at Figma, you get so much feedback on it, and everybody's riffing always on top of each other, that you'll never end up with one solution. Right. You have like 5 different options, and like it's more the challenge of like, how do we pick the option from like 5 of them, rather than like, oh, I have one and I know it's the best one, because everything has like pros and cons.
Is that about it relating, I guess, more broadly to like a holistic vision for where that direction of travel is going to be, though? Because probably of those 5 options that you're being presented with, there's something that ties more clearly to an overarching theme or vision for that specific section of the product, to drive that clarity, which I think then leans into the idea of a gut feel a bit more around it, because you're like, I can consistently argue for this. And the challenge is always like how much you build in favor of that vision before you go, this is just not working, and maybe unship something. But
you do have to be careful with the gut feeling of when you're looking at feedback, because you can kind of just pick the feedback you want to, and it's very easy to just ignore the others. Like, that didn't agree with what I think, so I'm just going to ignore that, pretend it doesn't exist. So you kind of have to keep that open mind and be like, okay, I'm seeing this again. Even if it doesn't agree with what I think, I need to start questioning myself and bring that back in.
Yeah, and I think one thing I love is that the entire team is involved and has the context of all this feedback. So if someone is kind of like ignoring some feedback we got, there's always someone else keeping them honest and floating back something that we've heard before, to make sure we're addressing that as well.
I think also we do a lot of the prototypes, and I feel like that helps a lot. Because even you're like, oh, this one idea, I think it's going to work. And then you try the prototype and you're like, maybe not.
So on that, when it comes to feasibility of the 5 ideas that we have, how do you jump in technically to first validate that we can even conceive of this, and then also use it as an opportunity to test it?
Yeah, so I think often like when we're discussing options, we can spend a long time like discussing, can we do this, can we do that? And actually, like, when you just like go away and code something quickly, it takes like an hour or 2, and just have a kind of proof of concept, that can like accelerate the conversation so much, because it's no longer like this decision is contingent on something else. It's like, okay, we know we could do that. Actually, yeah, that's the best option, rather than trying to like sidestep it. And, so that really speeds things up. And I think prototypes in general is just amazing for speeding up decisions. Like, it's a little bit counterintuitive that you think you're spending time building something which you're not going to use, you're probably going to throw it away. So feels like it's wasted time, but actually like that's saving you a ton of time in all your decision making, making sure you're not going down like, you could make like the perfect, most beautiful looking piece of UI, and then you realize like, oh wait, we actually wanted to do something different. But you would have caught that much earlier if you'd had a prototype. So you're just saving yourself tons of time down the road with that.
And what's the proximity of design to that exercise?
I think it's very, very close. I think especially working on a tool, it's very open-ended. So you don't have like a flow that you follow and then you do like static mocks and that's it. Like people like use it and use it in so many different ways, and that's the amazing things. Like working very quickly on a project with engineering just like makes such a difference because the interaction is very different of like working on that.
Yeah, if you can, I really recommend like the designer and engineer are almost like pairing together. Like it's just when you have like the designer works in isolation, hands it off to the developer works in isolation, I feel like that just slows things down a lot more. But when you've got that really like you're in a meeting together, you're jamming on ideas, then it just answers all those like micro questions you have along the way like instantly.
I think that's a part of process that still a lot of teams are yet to adopt. Like based on the conversations that we have, I think that there's a tendency for teams to still feel that they have to work very linearly because they're not taking the idea of the product team being a single function, and it's still very much, you know, this is design and this is engineering. And so how time is owned is, I think, the biggest challenge that a lot of these teams face. I know we're sort of now talking a bit more about process than users in this, but to get to those solutions and getting to the right solution for it, time and time again, there's this challenge of. So if we're going to create a prototype, this needs to be a ticket in a backlog, and it needs to be a POC rather than like, this is just an exploration in the time that we have around this. And we know that through doing this exercise, we can be less rigid in needing to write all of these requirements out because that will naturally come out through the prototyping process. So the bigger question is, how do you get to something like that? And that time is obviously protected internally at Figma, but I'm also interested to kind of know where the negotiation for something like we need to move towards a shipping, like I guess on the engineering management side.
Yeah, I feel like thinking about a shared goal that we have and thinking about like the end user and what would be the best for them is how we mitigate that. Because at Figma, I don't feel like a designer and a developer would have different goals, or we would ideally not have them work towards different milestones. Yep. And once we're all thinking about the same thing and working towards the same thing, that kind of solves that problem. So I think if you can get to that, that is huge. And I guess that does start from like design leadership, engineering leadership, but I think can go a long way.
So when we think about maybe traditional setups where you're a designer working a couple of weeks ahead of engineering, you conceive it, you pass it over to the engineering to build it, you maybe have that loop back and forth, but it sounds like you're way tighter aligned. How do you then manage multiple products or projects at the same time?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's challenging, but like, so for example, right now I'm on 3 projects. With one, it's very interaction based. So even if I did like mocks in advance, like this is the solution, we wouldn't have gone very far. So we did like daily stand-ups with engineering, and we're like, okay, what we want to try today? And then we would like talk quickly about the solution, mock things really quickly in the morning, and then he would go and like make the prototype, and then I would go and like move on to another project during the day, do something else, and then we see at the end of the day or like in the next morning, and then we like iterate on. But I think it's just like figuring times like we can work on it together and figure out like what is not working, what we want to tweak.
I think design still needs to be ahead of engineering. I don't think you can say we're just like starting at the same time exactly in parallel. There still needs to be like, there's a bit of a buffer, like it's really good to work together, but it's a kind of, there's a time and a place, and sometimes you do need to just have your solo work, your focus time to produce something. So I think there still needs to be like a bit of a buffer. You're like a little bit ahead, but then as you reach decisions, you're just kind of discussing things together. So like the engineer knows exactly where the designer is, but they're still a bit ahead in kind of what they're designing versus what you're building, because just naturally it takes a bit longer. and you want to have like that buffer so the engineer's not twiddling their thumbs waiting for the kind of what to build exactly.
You mentioned before about sometimes we then pivot into building dashboards of tracking once we've actually built the thing. So what signals do we then take once you've had the idea, designed it, coded it, launched it, put it under feature flags, and it's out in the world?
Yeah, this is one of the exciting moments, I guess, to see the graphs starting to come up, hopefully. And I feel like, yeah, we usually try to have some sort of success metrics that we define for the project. We try to talk about them as early as when we kick off the project, but obviously they can change and get refined throughout the life cycle of a project. And then when we ship it, we usually track it. Yeah, sometimes we work really close to a data scientists. Sometimes, again, engineers are the one building dashboards, and we track the features we ship. We look for many things. I mean, obviously we have engineering dashboards that we want to see that features are performing as they should, that they're not too slow or laggy, that we are not getting errors that we want to fix, and that is a time after we ship a feature that we're going to track it really closely and set up the right alerts so that we can stop tracking it really closely and just know when something's off. But then there's also the product metrics that we're trying to learn from. As Natalie said before, like there is only some answers that you can get from the data, and you always need a bigger view to understand the full picture, but there is still so much we can learn. And I feel like oftentimes our roadmap or like our next focus does come up from data and from our conversation with the data scientists that are just really great product collaborators. Like a lot of ideas come up from looking at our data, and a lot of good directions come up from having those conversations and digging deeper and deeper.
So would that effectively be the starting point of, we have a really strong signal here in the data, let's explore that as a mini project, and would that sometimes not ever get shipped, but it's still explored?
Yeah, I feel like we learn so much from that, from like mapping out the funnel of how does user interaction look across our tools. As Natalie said, again, like this is a tool, so users might use it in different ways, and there are a lot of patterns that we can recognize. We can identify different cohorts of users, and then maybe even talk to these users and get more color onto why they're behaving the way they are. So yeah, I feel like that's a big part from either sparking a new idea for a project, supporting the product lifecycle as it goes, and obviously then also validating to see that we're seeing the result that we hoped for when we built something.
And on the maintenance side of a feature that you've designed and built, longer term, is there a fixed plan of, I'm going to check in on X, Y, Z in a week, 2 weeks, a month, 6 months to see how it's going from a data perspective or even usability standpoint to then refine your ideas?
I feel like the feedback and the data is like weaved into our processes and like rituals. So like we have a Monday kickoff for like the team, and then we check the KRs. So you know like on the projects like where you are, like what's the latest. For user feedback, we have a summary that goes into channels. So you also see that. Honestly, it's a great morning ritual that like I sit down with my coffee, I open the feedback channel, I'm like, okay, this is it. It's like, it's not a specific time that you go, it's like in a week after like the feature has launched, but it's like almost weaved in every day. So you get the signals on an ongoing basis. When we ship a feature, we usually already have like a V2 of it in mind. Like I think there's always something that you're scoping out or deprioritizing. So always there's already like a long list of features that we're ready to go on and implement. But sometimes it's actually nice to give the feature some time to rest or bake outside in the real world and then come back to it a few weeks later or a few months later. And you usually have like a fresh perspective on what really needs to be the V2 of this feature.
You also need to think ahead about bugs. So like bugs is just inevitable. Everyone writes bugs. It's just part of life. So like you need to make sure you've got some time, like after you've just shipped something, you don't want to be straight into something else, which is like going to take up all your time. You need a little bit of buffer for like having some time to fix those bugs. But then not all of them come up straight away. And just over a longer period of time, we make sure we've always got at least one engineer on the team who's like their sole purpose, their sole job for that week is just fixing bugs. So anything new that's coming in, they're taking them immediately, fixing them really quickly to like stop any kind of customer issues. So you just make sure you've got a process that you can handle those bugs coming in as well.
Okay, let's finish on bugs. Thank you all very much. Our learnings today are to find the paper cuts, discover your design process to understand the key challenges that you're trying to solve for your users, building a feature flag program, have many signals of user feedback from forums to social media to Slack channel integrations, and build the best product you can with all these signals mixed up. Thank you very much, and thanks for watching.